Stay with me until the end.
Sylvie Marsh was 24 years old, the morning she arrived in Holt Creek with nothing but a carpetbag, a letter she couldn't bring herself to open, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from missing sleep. It comes from missing a life.
The stagecoach let her off at the edge of town.
Which wasn't much of a town at all. A general store, a livery, a church with a leaning steeple, and a saloon that looked more permanent than any of the others put together. Dust hung in the air the way it does in places that have given up expecting rain. She stood there with her bag in both hands and looked at the letter again. Her uncle Bertrand had written it 6 weeks ago, before he died. She knew that much because the lawyer in Topeka had told her so when he handed it over. She hadn't read it yet. She wasn't sure she wanted to know what a man who'd ignored her existence for 24 years had to say at the end of his. What she knew was this. Bertrand Marsh had owned land. 80 acres north of Holt Creek, a cattle operation that had once been something, and a house that the lawyer described as structurally sound. What she also knew, the part that had kept her awake on the 2-day stagecoach ride, was that under Nebraska territorial inheritance law, an unmarried woman under 25 could not hold the deed to property without a male guardian co-signing every transaction. She had 32 days before her uncle's estate would be absorbed by his creditors. 32 days to either find a guardian, find a husband, or watch 80 acres of her only future disappear into someone else's pocket. She opened the letter. Sylvie, it read. I know I wasn't there. I know that doesn't fix anything. The land is yours if you want it. There's a man named Gareth Lund who works the north fence. He's been on this property 11 years. He doesn't talk much, but he's honest. And honest is harder to find than you'd think out here. Ask him about the water rights before anyone else gets to you. The water rights are everything. Don't let them tell you otherwise. BM, no apology, no explanation, just information. She folded the letter back up and put it in her coat pocket. Then she picked up her bag and started walking north. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke and cattle and something sharper underneath, like iron. The house came into view over a shallow rise, a low-slung structure of dark timber, a porch that sagged on one end, a barn in better condition than anything else on the property. There were fence posts running west as far as she could see, and beyond them, cattle. Not many, but enough to tell her the land still had some life in it. A man was replacing a hinge on the barn door when she came up the drive. He didn't stop what he was doing. He just looked up at her the way men in that part of the country looked at things that didn't fit. With quiet assessment, nothing given away. Gareth Lund was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, though weather had a way of aging a man's face faster than his years. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of hands that had never not once been idle. There was a scar along his left jaw that had healed clean, and his eyes were the particular gray of overcast November. Not cold exactly, just careful. He looked at her for a long moment. You'd be the niece, he said. Sylvie Marsh, she said. Bertrand was my mother's brother. He nodded once, like that confirmed something he'd already worked out. He talked about you, he said. Then he went back to the hinge. She waited. He didn't add anything. He said to ask you about the water rights, she said. That made him stop. He set the screwdriver down on the fence post and turned to face her fully for the first time. He had the look of a man reassessing something. He told you that specifically? In the letter. First thing he wrote down. Gareth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How long are you planning to stay? That depends on how the next 32 days go. He looked at her bag. He looked at the house. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite read. Come inside, he said. I'll put coffee on. He told her about the water rights over 2 cups of coffee at a table that had seen better decades. The situation was not complicated, but it was bad. A man named Clifton Reeves, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county and had been trying to buy Bertrand's land for the better part of 3 years, had filed a claim with the county clerk 6 days after Bertrand's death, disputing the upstream water access that fed the Marsh property. Without that water, the 80 acres were worth a fraction of their value. Without the 80 acres worth anything, Sylvie had nothing to fight over. Did my uncle know, she asked. He knew Reeves wanted the land, Gareth said. He didn't know about the filing. He died before anyone told him. Did you know? He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I knew 3 days ago. I wrote to the lawyer in Topeka. The letter must have crossed with you on the road. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up and pushed at the window glass. The light was going low and golden, the way prairie light does in late afternoon, and it made the kitchen look warmer than it probably was. What's the filing based on? She asked. Reeves claims the water source originates on his property, and the access agreement your uncle had was a handshake deal, not a legal easement. Was it? Gareth looked at her steadily. No, there's a written agreement. Your uncle had it drawn up in 1871 by a judge in Chadron.
I've seen the document. Where is it now? I don't know.
He said it plainly, like a man who'd already spent considerable time thinking about this. It was in your uncle's files. The files are in the house. I haven't gone through them. It wasn't my place.
Sylvie set her cup down. It is now, she said.
The files were in a trunk under Bertrand's bed, which told her something about her uncle, that he kept the things that mattered close to where he slept. She and Gareth went through them that first evening and into the next morning, and she learned more about Bertrand Marsh in 12 hours than she had in 24 years of not knowing him. He'd come to Nebraska in 1868 with $40 and a mule.
He'd built the barn before he'd built the house. He'd kept records of every head of cattle he'd ever sold, every fence post he'd ever purchased,
every rain that had fallen in a season worth measuring. He'd written letters to her mother who had never mentioned them, and they were tied in a bundle with twine, unopened on his end, which meant her mother had returned them, all of them.
Sylvie didn't open those. She kept looking. The water rights agreement wasn't in the trunk.
It wasn't in the desk in the main room. It wasn't in the barn office, which was really just a shelf with a ledger on it, or in the lockbox under the floorboard in the kitchen, which held only $63 in cash and a pocket watch engraved with initials she didn't recognize. Someone moved it, Gareth said. He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like a man reading weather, straightforward, unsentimental, preparing for what was coming. Reeves? She asked. Or someone who works for him. Your uncle had a man helping with the East herd who stopped showing up about a week before the death. He paused. I didn't think much of it at the time. Sylvie sat down on the edge of the trunk. The morning light was coming through the single east-facing window, and somewhere outside one of the horses was making itself known.
I need that document, she said. I know. I also need. She stopped. Started again. The lawyer said I can't hold the deed without a guardian or a husband. I'm 24. The law's the law.
Gareth said nothing for a moment. Then, I know that too. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people looking at the same problem from different sides and arriving at the same conclusion without wanting to say it first. She said it.
I don't know you, she said.
I've known you for approximately 14 hours.
I'm not asking you to.
I'm not saying this is something you owe me.
You don't owe me anything.
She looked at her hands. But my uncle said you were honest, and he was specific about that, which makes me think he meant it as more than a passing observation.
Gareth was quiet for a long time.
What would it be? He asked.
Legally.
A marriage of agreement, she said.
For the purpose of property protection.
You'd have no claim on the land. I'd put it in writing.
Once the estate is settled and the water rights are resolved, we could.
She stopped again.
We could figure out the rest, he said. Yes.
He stood up from where he'd been crouching by the trunk, unfolding to his full height in the small room. He looked out the east window at the land. His land, in the sense that he'd worked it and known it, and gotten up before light for it every day for 11 years.
There's a judge in Millard, he said, about 8 miles east.
I know, she said. I looked at the map last night.
Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but something in the neighborhood of one.
We'd need 2 witnesses, he said.
I know that too.
He nodded once, the same nod he'd given her when she'd arrived, confirmation of something already understood. I'll hitch the wagon, he said, and walked out. The judge's name was Theodore Albright, and he had the look of a man who'd officiated enough frontier marriages to have stopped being surprised by the circumstances of any of them. He asked twice whether they were certain.
Sylvie said yes both times. Gareth said yes once.
Like once was sufficient.
The 2 witnesses were the judge's wife and a man named Percy who'd been waiting in the anteroom to file a land survey and found himself drafted into history. There were no flowers. There was no music. The judge's wife cried anyway, which Sylvie found unexpectedly comforting. Afterward, driving back to the ranch in the wagon, the late afternoon light slanted across the flat land and made everything look temporarily beautiful. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The wheels found the ruts in the road and followed them. I want to find that document,
Sylvie said finally.
I've been thinking about where it might be, Gareth said. And your uncle used a bank in Millard for the cattle accounts. He didn't entirely trust his own filing system. He kept his eyes on the road. I should have thought of the bank 3 days ago. That was a mistake. She looked at the side of his face. You were dealing with a dead man's estate and a disputed water claim and a stranger showing up at your gate, she said. I think you can forgive yourself the oversight.
He glanced at her sideways.
You're direct, he said. My mother says it's a flaw. Your mother's wrong. It wasn't much. It was, in fact, almost nothing at all. But it was the first thing Gareth Lund said to her that felt like it was about her, specifically, and not about the situation, and she noticed it the way you notice a light coming on in a window you thought was empty. The document was in the bank. It took 2 days and a letter from the judge, and a considerable amount of Gareth's patience with a clerk who seemed constitutionally opposed to locating anything on the first try. But on the afternoon of the third day, after their marriage, they walked out of the Millard Savings and Trust with a certified copy of the water rights easement, dated 1871, signed by a judge and 2 witnesses and Bertrand Marsh himself, and countersigned by the previous owner of the Reeves property, who, it turned out, had sold to Clifton Reeves in 1879, with the easement explicitly noted in the deed transfer. Reeves had known. He'd bought the land knowing the easement existed. His filing with the county clerk was not a mistake. It was a calculation, the assumption that a dead man's niece, young and alone and newly arrived, wouldn't know where to look or how to push back. He'd miscalculated. The county clerk's office received the certified document the following morning. Reeves's claim was dismissed within the week. What came after was quieter and harder, in the way that things are when the emergency is over and you're left with the ordinary. Sylvie moved into the house that had been her uncle's, her house now, and began the particular work of learning a place. She was not a rancher's daughter. She'd grown up in Topeka. She'd worked as a seamstress. She'd read more books than she'd let on to anyone because women who read too many books were considered to have ideas above their station. She had in fact ideas about quite a lot of things, but she kept most of them to herself while she figured out what she didn't know, which was considerable. Gareth taught her without making a lesson of it. He showed her how to check the fence line for breaks after a storm, and how to read the cattle for signs of illness, and which of the 3 horses was not to be trusted on a sloping path. He didn't explain everything. Some things he just did next to her, and she watched, and eventually she could do them too. He lived in the bunkhouse. This had been his arrangement under Bertrand, and he saw no reason to change it. Sylvie didn't ask him to. She was aware, in a way she hadn't expected to be, that they were both proceeding with care, 2 people sharing a life's infrastructure without yet knowing what shape the life itself should take. They ate dinner together most nights, because it was practical. Conversation came slowly at first, and then less slowly. She learned that he'd come to Nebraska from Pennsylvania at 19, following a brother who'd died of fever in the second winter. She learned that he'd stayed because leaving felt like abandoning the brother's grave, and then because he'd built something, and you don't walk away from what you've built. She learned that he'd read most of the books she'd read, which surprised her, and that he had opinions about them, which surprised her more. He learned that she was funny. She didn't advertise it, but it was there in the way she said things, dry and precise and perfectly timed. It took him 3 weeks to laugh out loud at something she said, and when he did, it was so unexpected that she stared at him for a moment before laughing too. Something was changing between them. She knew it the way you know the temperature has dropped, not because you looked at a thermometer, but because the air on your skin is different. She didn't know what to do about it, so she didn't do anything. She was practical that way. Clifton Reeves was not finished. She should have expected that. A man who buys land with a fraudulent claim in his pocket does not accept defeat graciously. What she hadn't anticipated was how he'd come at them next, not through the courts, but through the bank. Reeves had interests in the Millard Savings and Trust, not a controlling stake, but enough of one to have conversations. The conversations, she learned later, had concerned the outstanding balance on the loan Bertrand had taken out in 1876 to expand the herd. The loan was not in default, the payments were current, but the bank had the right, under certain circumstances, to call the full balance due if the operation showed signs of material instability. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, repayment in full within 60 days, or the bank would seek judgment on the property. Sylvie read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and went outside and stood in the yard for a while, looking at the land. Gareth found her there. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it, and his jaw did something she'd come to recognize, a slight tightening, restrained and deliberate, the physical version of a man keeping his voice even. "How much?" she asked. "More than we have," he said. "How much more?" He looked at her. "Sylvie, tell me," he told her. She did the math in her head. Then she sat down on the porch step, which was not a thing she usually did, and he sat down next to her without being asked, which was not a thing he usually did, and they were quiet together in the particular way they'd gotten good at. "There's the east pasture," she said. "If we sold the grazing rights." "Not enough. The cattle, we'd be selling the operation to save the land. There's no land without the operation." She knew he was right. She sat with that. "There's one thing," he said, carefully. She waited. "My brother had a savings account. When he died, it came to me. I've never touched it." He paused. "It's enough." She turned to look at him. "That's not. It's mine to use how I decide," he said. "I decide this, Gareth. I've been here 11 years, he said. "I'm not leaving because Clifton Reeves wants the water." He said it quietly, without heat, the way he said most things, Like the statement simply described a fact of the universe, and he was just reporting it accurately. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze without flinching, which was, she had come to understand, something he only did when he meant a thing completely. I'll pay you back, she said. I know you will, he said. I'm not worried about it. They sat on the porch step until the light was gone. At some point their shoulders were touching, neither of them having moved deliberately to make it so, and neither of them moved away. The loan was paid. The bank closed the account with a letter that had all the warmth of a bill of sale. Reeves made no further moves against the property, which likely meant he'd found someone else's land to covet. That was the thing about men like Clifton Reeves. They weren't committed to any particular piece of land, only to the acquisition of it. When acquisition became inconvenient, they moved on. Spring came to Holt Creek the way it always did on the plains, slowly and then all at once. The grass came back. The creek ran high with snowmelt. Sylvie planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house, which Gareth thought was impractical, and which produced, by July, more tomatoes than 2 people could reasonably eat. She was 25 now. The law that had constrained her at 24 had no more claim on her. The deed was in her name, clear and uncontested. She had not needed to do anything about the marriage. She thought about this while she was weeding the garden one afternoon in early June. She thought about it with the particular care she gave to things she didn't want to think about carelessly. She heard him come around the side of the house before she saw him. He'd been mending the north fence. She knew from the direction he came from and the way his shirt was dirty at the forearms. He stopped when he saw her looking at him. I've been thinking, she said. About what? About the fact that I'm 25. He was quiet. He'd known that as well as she had. The reason we married is no longer legally relevant, she said. She kept her voice even, which cost her something. You could file. It would be straightforward. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Is that what you want? She looked down at the garden. A June bug was working its way along a tomato vine with great determination and very little apparent sense of direction. No, she said. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet she'd learned to wait through. Last November, he said. When you sat down on the porch step, after the bank letter. Yes. I almost said something then. She looked up at him. He was still standing at the corner of the house, one hand on the wall, with all the careful stillness of a man who'd spent years learning not to say things too soon. You should have, she said. I know that now. She stood up from the garden, brushing the dirt from her hands. She walked toward him and stopped close enough that she could see the specific gray of his eyes. Not cold. She'd been right about that from the beginning. Just careful. Just waiting until it was safe. Gareth Lund, she said. I would like to stay married to you. Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, he wasn't a dramatic man, but it was there, unmistakable, the thing underneath all that careful stillness finally having somewhere to go. That works out, he said. Because I'm not going anywhere. They were married in the practical, already legal sense, and then they were married in the true sense, which is harder to accomplish and has nothing to do with the judge's office. The second kind took time, the way things worth having usually do. She learned how to read cattle for illness, and eventually got good at it. He learned to eat tomatoes in every conceivable preparation without complaint, and eventually got to like it. She told him about the books she'd kept quiet about in Topeka, and he had opinions about all of them, and the arguments they had about fiction were the best arguments of her life. The north fence held, the water ran. The herd grew slowly, which was the right way for a herd to grow. By the 3rd year, they'd replaced the porch boards on the sagging end and added a room to the east side of the house, which turned out to be necessary sooner than either of them had quite planned for. Their daughter was born in April, small and loud and thoroughly opinionated from her first hour, in ways that Gareth said came from her mother, and Sylvie said came from him, and neither of them ever resolved. They didn't need to. The letters her uncle had written to her mother, the ones that had been returned unopened, she put them in the trunk and kept them there for a long time uncertain. Then one winter evening, with the snow coming down and the stove going, and the baby asleep in the next room, she opened one. It was dated 1882. Her mother would have been in her 30s. Her uncle's handwriting was careful and a little formal, like a man who didn't write letters often. I think you'd like Nebraska, he wrote. It's honest country, doesn't pretend to be more than it is. That's rare. She read it twice. Then she put it back in the envelope and set it with the others. She thought maybe she'd write to her mother. Maybe her mother, after enough time, would be able to hear it. That was the thing about honest country. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't force the soil. You could only work it, and wait, and trust that what you'd planted was worth the patience. She'd learned that here. From the land, and from the man who knew it better than anyone. From the life she almost hadn't let herself have.